Greetings, I'm Fred Zaspel, and welcome to another author interview here at Books at a Glance. We are talking today to Voddie Baucham. He is no stranger, I think, to most of our readers here at Books at a Glance. And today he's with us to talk about his new and very timely and important new book, Fault Lines, The Social Justice Movement and Evangelicalism's Looming Catastrophe. Voddie, welcome and congratulations on an excellent and a very important book.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you and talk about it.
All right. First, your title, Fault Lines. That's a metaphor you take through the book, actually, and in many ways carries your argument. So tell us what the metaphor is all about and what is the catastrophe that you see looming over evangelicalism?
Well, fault lines are the place where earthquakes take place. They are these fissures, these divisions in the earth where these plates sort of shift and cause catastrophic events. And having been born on the San Andreas Fault in Los Angeles, California, and having been in earthquakes, not only in LA, but also in other places, in Japan, for example, which is along the Ring of Fire, that same series of faults. As I look at what's happening in the church today, all I could think of was people standing on two sides of a fault that was about to shift or that was in the process of shifting. A lot of people think, that the subtitle may be a bit much or it's a bit over the top, but I really do see this as catastrophic. I think churches are being divided, denominations are being divided, families are being divided, friendships, long-standing friendships are being lost, people are losing their jobs. This is catastrophic.
Yeah, it is. All right, before we get into some of the other matters, let's make sure everybody understands the terminology that we're talking about. We hear a lot these days about critical theory, critical race theory, social justice, intersectionality, and those kinds of things. So maybe if you can just briefly explain what all of that is about.
Yeah, and I try to do that in the book as well. I have what's called a thought line. It's not just a timeline, but I really try to trace these ideas. And I try to go back to Karl Marx and Karl Marx's conflict theory and his understanding that really the relationships between people should be understood from power dynamics. Later on, the idea of the bourgeois and the proletariat, the haves and the have-nots. And then coming from him, there was an expectation that the workers of the world would unite, that there would be a great uprising. And it did happen in the Bolshevik Revolution, but it didn't happen in other places where they expected it. Places, for example, like Germany and like England. And so later on, there's an Italian Marxist by the name of Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci brings the idea of cultural hegemony, the idea that people are being oppressed, not just through means of production, but really through means of culture. And Gramsci was very interested in the robes of culture, the lawyers and the professors and the preachers and things like media and education and the way that those things really influenced the masses and really kept them in check. Later on, you get the Frankfurt School, and this is where critical theory comes from. In the 1930s and 40s, the Frankfurt School, again, started in Frankfurt, Germany. World War II breaks out, and they come to the United States and begin what's often referred to as the Long March through the institutions. These are people who had very important teaching posts and critical theory, teaching posts in universities around the country. Right. And so critical theory is sometimes it's referred to as cultural Marxism. The idea that a culture has to be weakened first before that revolution can take place. And it was Gramsci who said that, sociology is that idea that will usurp Christianity. Or socialism, I said sociology, socialism, that idea, that worldview that will ultimately usurp Christianity. And so, again, from Marx through Gramsci to the Frankfurt School, coming to critical theory, and critical theory is really based on the assumptions of Marx and Hegel. It's based on the assumption of power dynamics. Then we get to critical race theory. Critical theory and critical legal studies, again, that word critical is very important. There's also critical social justice. That word critical harkens back to this idea of power dynamics and the assumption of power dynamics and oppression, and the assumption that you're critiquing something with a view toward breaking down where those power dynamics are being abused and replacing it with something else. Okay. So critical legal studies, again, applying critical theory to legal studies. Critical race theory comes out of critical legal studies. And it's the idea of applying this specifically to race within the realm of law. And critical race theory is really the brainchild of a professor at Harvard Law School, Derek Bell. And then coming out of that is the idea of intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw was a protege of Bell's at Harvard Law School, and she came up with the idea of intersectionality. So again, critical theory, critical legal studies, oppressor, oppressed, cultural hegemony. What Crenshaw is saying is that not only are people oppressed within their individual groups and with their individual group identities, but there are intersecting and interlocking experiences of oppression. So a Black person is oppressed, a Black female is doubly oppressed, a Black trans female triple, and so on and so forth. So these are just that's just sort of a rough sketch of these ideas that I'm really sort of dealing with and unpacking in the book.
Yeah, and you point out that the word critical you mentioned here is very important. You point out in the book that the word critical is specifically a revolutionary idea, and it's not
Yes.
tied to any specific concept of truth either, is it?
No, it really, most critical studies really don't hold to the idea of truth, that there is any absolute truth. There's just the cultural hegemony. We believe in an absolute truth because the powers that be have created a hegemony, which is designed to keep them in power and keep other people oppressed. So the idea that we're somehow looking for this objective truth is really outside of the realm of critical theory, especially critical race theory, because critical race theory rejects the scientific method. It rejects classical liberalism. It rejects meritocracy and so on and so forth, and talks about other ways of knowing.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk social justice. Every Christian has to be in favor of social justice. But will you make the point, and it's very important here to emphasize, that what's today called social justice is not the same as what biblically defined social justice is. Talk to us about that.
Well, I go even further, and I say there is no biblically defined social justice. Social justice is redistributive justice. The idea of social justice is very clearly defined. The literature is clear. You go to Merriam-Webster online, you go to the Oxford Dictionary of the English Language, you go to academic research and academic papers on social justice. Social justice is redistributive justice. It is not justice from man to man. It is the understanding that the government is going to look in the society, look for inequities. And by the way, inequity is different than inequality. Equity is about outcomes. So it's going to look for inequitable outcomes, and it will not look to explain why those outcomes are inequitable. It will assume that it's inequitable because of injustice and because of racism and because of classism, sexism, homophobia, so on and so forth. And then it will work to redistribute wealth and redistribute power, specifically power, and redistribute power based on these group dynamics. So that's what social justice means. It's governmental, it's distributed. So it's really ironic that Christians are talking about social justice, because social justice takes justice outside of the realm of the church and puts it in the realm of the government.
Interesting. All right. We hear all the time that racism today in America is systemic. I know racism exists, and I suspect it will exist until the new heaven and new earth. But just speaking from my own standpoint here, and I want you to help us with this, I don't see racism, one, as one-sided, and two, I don't see it as systemic. Now, I'm a white guy. Am I missing something? And what should people of every color know about this discussion?
Yeah, so the concept of systemic racism or structural racism, however you want to look at it, this is rooted in critical theory and specifically in critical race theory. The idea there's four real main tenets of critical race theory. If I can just summarize them quickly,
Mhm.
the first one of them is that racism is normal. Racism is everywhere. If you got kids and they watch the Lego movie, there's a song on there, everything is awesome. Well, in critical race theory, everything is racist. Like everything is racist. That's the answer for everything. If you see inequities between people of various ethnicities, racism is the answer. Okay. The second one is the idea of convergence or interest convergence theory. And this is the idea that white people are incapable of righteous actions in the area of race and racism unless their interests converge. And so we've got original sin. Now we got total depravity, right? White people are totally depraved when it comes to racism and are incapable of righteous action, which is why everything is racist. The third one is a rejection of um, liberalism, classical liberalism, the idea of meritocracy, the idea of objectivity. There's a rejection of this. And then there's this fourth principle, which is that truth is understood through narrative. And this is why, for example, people are talking about elevating Black voices, elevating minority voices, because that's the way that we come to truth. The Bible is not sufficient. In fact, the Bible is part of the cultural hegemony. And in the critical social justice movement, the Bible and Christianity, not only is there white privilege, but there's also Christian privilege. And Christian privilege is as pernicious as white privilege. And Christianity is as problematic as whiteness within critical social justice. So these are kind of the principles. So when you talk about systemic racism, we're talking about the critical race theory concept that racism is normal and ubiquitous and that racism is everywhere. This, for example, is why the 1619 Project is so important for critical race theorists, because what that does is if America is based in our founding in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, or 1787, right, with the ratification of the Constitution, then the principles upon which we are built are the principles in the Declaration and the principles in the Constitution. But if 1619 is when America becomes America, and if the significance of 1619 is that's when slaves first came to America, then everything is racist, right? Everything.
Right.
See, that's what you got to understand about the 1619 Project and other things, that this has nothing to do with history or historiography. This has everything to do with critical race theory and trying to establish the fact that America is inherently racist and is irreparably racist, which is why Ibram X. Kendi, the father of anti-racism, he proposed an amendment to the Constitution and the establishment of the Department of Anti-Racism, because that's the only way that you can deal with this if you understand it from their perspective.
Well, how is the current social justice movement deepening rather than healing race relations?
I think it's doing it in a number of ways. And first of all, is it's making everything about race. Period, full stop. Everything is about race. And so whenever something happens in the news, if ever something happens with the police, if ever something happens with a mass shooting, we want to know what was the race of the officer? What was the race of the mass shooter? What was the race? We want to know that, right? Because everything is racist. The second thing that it's doing is it's causing this division because, remember, according to critical race theory, and again, we're hearing it everywhere, we have to elevate Black voices and we have to listen to the voice of the oppressed. So when George Floyd dies or Breonna Taylor dies, we don't look at the facts of the case. Remember the third principle? That's the third principle of critical race theory, right? We reject things like the scientific method and meritocracy and objectivity and so on and so forth. You reject that. So that's principle number three. Principle number four, these different ways of knowing, narrative is the way that we access truth. So if you want to understand George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, so on and so forth, listen to the voice of the oppressed, and they will tell you what the truth is. And so one of the reasons that we're being divided is because you got some people who are looking at these things and saying, wait a minute, the facts seem to indicate X. And then other people who are saying, you're just jumping to that conclusion because of your whiteness, white supremacy, because of your white fragility, so on and so forth. And if you really want to understand this, what you need to do is sit down, shut up, and listen to the voice of the oppressed, and we'll tell you what the truth is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's inherently divisive.
It is.
You can't get there from here. It's grossly unbiblical, right? Everybody.
There's no room for two-way discussion in that.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because the assumption is that white people are oppressed.
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, white people are oppressors, right?
Yeah.
And that they are incapable, again, principle number 2, interest convergence. You're incapable of righteous actions unless it serves your own interests.
Yeah.
And so it's really pernicious. And the other thing, I would say one other thing that it's doing is people are falling all over themselves to, hire Black people and listen to Black voices and elevate Black voices. Black people are being put in positions left and right. Fortune 500 companies are going into price wars over hiring Black people. Colleges and universities are, beating the bushes to find every Black person that they can. All sorts of industries are now, trying to elevate, minority voices. And what that's doing is it's causing people to look at the accomplishments of minorities with skepticism, because the assumption is going to be, you didn't earn that.
Yeah.
You don't deserve that. It was given to you. You see? Yeah. So, and that's just a few examples of why this is problematic.
Yeah. All right. In one of your chapters, you deal with the false narratives and their consequences. So tell us about that. What are the false narratives that you're trying to expose, and how have they contributed to the problem?
Well, the main false narrative is the idea that the police are out there hunting down and killing Black men. That's the overarching false narrative. That's the one that proves everything else, right? And so we have this idea that inequities exist because of racism. And if you blame anything other than racism, Robin DiAngelo, in her book, White Fragility, she talks about multiple kinds of racism. And one of those kinds of racism is aversive racism. And aversive racism happens when you look at a disparity and blame something other than racism for that disparity. So, for example, if we look at police shootings and deaths of people at the hands of police, and if we start looking at rates of violent crimes among various groups in order to try to explain that, well, that's aversive racism. And so what that does is it allows this false narrative to continue. And it is a false narrative. For example, we know George Floyd's name, and people are saying, absolutely, George Floyd was a smoking gun, right? If you didn't believe in racist treatment by police before George Floyd, certainly you have to believe in it now. And I'm going, wait a minute, there's a guy named Tony Timpa in Dallas, Texas, who was killed the exact same way. Actually, it wasn't the exact same way. With him, it was 14 minutes. on kneeling on his back and neck, as opposed to the 9 minutes with George Floyd. And the other difference, of course, is that the three officers in Dallas were not arrested or charged. They were back on the streets. They remained back on the streets. The video wasn't released for over a year until the media demanded the release of the video. And Tony Tempa's family has gotten, as far as I know, nothing. Certainly not, 27, 30, whatever $million. And the reason you don't know his name or his story is because he's white and it doesn't fit the false narrative. And I have a number of stories like that in that particular chapter. Because basically what I try to do is I try to demonstrate a number of ways. One, people argue that the statistical anomalies prove racism. And so what I look at is okay, Black people are die at the hands of police disproportionately. Okay, fine. Do we see those disparities anywhere else? Yes. Men die at the hands of police disproportionately, right? We make up half the population, but more than 90% of the people who die at the hands of police. What does that prove? Also, people between the ages of 18 and 45 are killed by police more than people under 18 or people over 45. Does that mean that there's discrimination? You see my point? Is that if that's the way we're going to do math, right?
Yeah, right.
Then it's hugely problematic. So that's the first thing I do in that chapter. And then I look at the individual cases, because some people will say, okay, well, fine, maybe mathematically. By the way, there's a number of mathematical studies that demonstrate that the police are less likely to shoot Black people than they are to shoot white people. Of course, they kill more white people than Black people every year by far. But there's also, work from a Harvard scholar, Roland Fryer, that shows that, the police are less likely actually to shoot Black people than they are white people. So first we deal with that. Then I deal with the individual stories. And we're like, okay, maybe statistically that's true, but these individual stories are so horrific. And I go through, the main stories, the Philando Castiles and Trayvon Martin and so on and so forth, and demonstrate how in every one of those instances, there is a parallel where a white person died the exact same way. Well, then people will say, well, maybe that's true, but when they kill Black people, they get away with it. And when they kill white people, they're held accountable. No, actually, that's not the case. There is no greater, percentage when it comes to, the cops being held accountable. Dylan Noble was shot and killed by a police officer. Hands up, don't shoot. It didn't happen in the Michael Brown case, but it did happen in the Dylan Noble case. And Dylan Noble was shot by a police officer and killed. And they were not convicted of that, did not go to jail for that. And Dylan Noble is white. And so in every one of those instances, I try to show there's at least one case where the same thing happened to a person who was not Black. And so that's not a valid argument either. Again, it's a false narrative.
Our cultural surrender of the notion of truth really is a huge factor here, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it goes back to critical race theory.
Yeah.
Because that's the third premise of critical race theory.
Yeah.
It attacks that very notion of truth. And it just kills me that there are Christian people, Christian leaders even, who are saying, well, we don't accept all of critical race theory, but, it's an important analytical tool for looking at, racism and racial disparities and so on and so forth. Well, that's like saying, well, we reject Hinduism, right? But I think Hinduism, is a good analytical tool for us to look at, spiritual reality and so on and so forth. If you have people in your church who are walking around talking about Krishna, Vishnu, Shiva, and Brahma, and Nirvana, and so on and so forth, and karma, you wouldn't say, well, they're just using an analytical tool, right? You would say, no, we need to back away from that. And we need to go to the scriptures, not to that other religion. And the reason I say that, and people might say it's a false dichotomy. No, the critical social justice movement is a religion. And
Yeah.
there's a whole chapter in the book where I sort of outline the religious nature of the movement itself.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about that next. You talk a lot about the religious nature of the anti-racism movement. So just highlight that for us.
Yeah, it absolutely is a religion. They have their own cosmology, the way the world came into being, right? In the beginning, white people created whiteness. And and the first day they created whiteness, second day they created white supremacy, and
Yep.
and all these other things, right? All the way down to white fragility. We have our saints, right? Say their names. Um, we have our own understanding of original sin. We have our own, again, racism as original sin,
Mhm.
our own understanding of depravity, total depravity. We have our own liturgies. It amazed me when people who were absolutely not liturgical, churches that have never had a liturgical service ever in the life of the church, were all of a sudden doing liturgies of lament.
Mhm.
It just, you know what
Yep.
this is part of that religious nature. The one thing that you don't find there, they have their own law, right?
Yeah.
Anti-racism. The one
Yep.
thing that you don't find is any kind of redemption. There is no redemption in the religion of anti-racism. It is perpetual penance.
Yeah.
It's not real repentance, because
Right.
again, white
Right.
people are incapable of righteous action in the area of race and racism. So it's just constant penance, and you have to do the work of anti-racism and constantly do the work of anti-racism. And you always have to be afraid that you're going to do something wrong, and then everything's going to be taken away from you, and it's going to be, aha,
Right.
I knew it. I knew
Right.
you were a racist.
Right. Right. All right. Well, how else then is the social justice movement at war with Christianity? We need to know that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I point out is that, there there are a number of articles and books on the social justice movement that clearly point to Christianity as not a problem, but the problem. And there's a book called Teachings for Diversity and Social Justice. It's a seminal text used in teacher training and other social science training. And this book equates Christian privilege with white privilege, and views Christianity the same way that the critical social justice movement views whiteness. It is a cancer that needs to be removed. And the other thing that we need to understand is that it's at war with Christianity, because the social justice movement, think about it as a train with a bunch of boxcars. And what Christians are doing is they're looking at the engine. They don't understand, conflict theory, critical theory, critical race theory. So they don't understand that. That's the engine. And we're like, I'm not sure what all that is. But then right behind it is the first boxcar. And that boxcar is called racial justice. And Christians are like, we're all for justice. We hate
Yeah.
racism.
Right.
And we're like, yes, we'll get on this boxcar. But right behind it is the radical feminist boxcar. And right behind that is the LGBTQIA plus boxcar. Right behind that is the climate justice boxcar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right behind that is the open borders justice boxcar. Right. But see, these things are all connected.
Yeah.
And the secular social justice movement is very clear about the fact that all of these things are connected. It's Christians who are the ones who are naive, who are being duped, who are jumping on this one boxcar as though we can go somewhere and not be
Yeah.
trailed by the
Right.
rest of the boxcars.
Right. All right. Well, that brings up another question that just puzzles me, and maybe you can help us with it. How do you explain the strong attraction to the social justice movement on the part of some otherwise respected evangelicals?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things going on. Number one, um, we're all about justice. We're all about love. We're not racist. Our brothers and sisters in Christ um, love the body. And I think there are a lot of people out there, a lot of leaders out there who for decades now have committed themselves and their ministries to racial reconciliation. And they have helped, trained, mentored, partnered with their Black brothers and sisters for decades now. And now some of those same brothers that they've partnered with are espousing either openly or and overtly, or at least, through using the terminology of this movement.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of guys who've decided, you know what, rather than burn those bridges and have those Black brothers and sisters say, aha, I knew you were racist all along. They've just decided to either stay silent or to give sort of tacit approval of the people while trying not to give approval of the message and the ideology. And they're trying to do everything they can not to speak out against those individuals, and therefore they don't speak out against these movements.
Well, the pressure seems to be just enormous to push.
Yeah, it
them.
is.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, it is. It is. And that's the sinister part of this, is that, these movements are latching on to some very real things and some very true things that we hold dear. And it's using them in order to get the camel's nose into the tent.
Yeah. All right. How do we respond to all of this? Talk to us about what you described in chapter 10 as the weapons that we have at our disposal.
Yeah, I think Paul's teaching in 2 Corinthians 10 is just poignant and apropos for this moment in time. We're not wrestling against flesh and blood. I think that's the first thing. We're not at war with our brothers. We're not. I don't have anything against anybody. I name, a number of people in the book, not to go to war with people, but to give examples of, good brothers who, for one reason or another, have begun to espouse some of these ideologies and terminologies, right? But I'm not at war with my brothers. I'm at war with this ideology.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's the first thing, right? We're not wrestling against flesh and blood. We're not at war with people. The other thing we need to understand is that, the weapons of our warfare are also not carnal. The weapons that we're using are spiritual weapons and not physical weapons. We're not going to war with our words. We're not going to war with, we're not doing those things. There are spiritual weapons, and they're powerful weapons that will destroy strongholds, that will destroy fortresses. And so what do we do with these weapons? And by the way, these weapons are word and spirit, right? Mm-hmm. What do we do with these weapons? Well, number one, we destroy every argument and lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. And that's what I'm trying to do here in this book.
Yeah, bring every thought captive.
Yes. Yeah, but that's next. First, you got to destroy.
Right.
So what we want to do, because there's an 11th commandment, and the 11th commandment is thou shalt be nice, right?
Yeah,
and
that's
so
right. That's right.
What we want to do is we want to take every thought captive, but we don't want to do the first part, which is destroying arguments, right? And that's what we have to do. And I think what some people are trying to do, in order to hold on to those relationships, is they want to say, okay, we're going to think about race, and we're going to think about racism, and we're going to take those thoughts captive, and we're going to learn how to do this from a biblical perspective. But what they refuse to do is destroy the arguments raised up against the knowledge of God. They don't want to destroy critical race theory and intersectionality. They don't want to destroy critical theory. They don't want to openly repudiate these things because there are people who are embracing them. And so they're trying to hold to that 11th commandment, thou shalt be nice, right? Yeah. And at the same time, they're also trying to avoid the finger being pointed at them and people calling them racist. Yeah. But we got to do both. We got to destroy arguments and speculations, and we have to take every thought captive. Yeah. Then taking every thought captive, we're not just being negative, saying no to this over here, but we're also embracing this biblical understanding of what our identity is and what justice is, right? And so when it comes to our identity, we're embracing the idea that there is one race, right? That there are multiple ethnicities, but there is one race, and that we are one in Christ. If you want to say there's two, right? The race of the first Adam and the race
Yeah,
of the last
right.
Adam, that's fine.
Yeah.
But ultimately, this idea of race and racism, we have to take these thoughts captive about who we are and what our differences are and what our differences mean. And then when it comes to justice, we have to have a biblical understanding of justice. And here's what's very interesting. One of the reasons that Christians are having a hard time with the idea of justice is because we've lost that balance between law and gospel. And we think, gospel, 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 gospel. But most people don't know the Ten Commandments anymore. And they certainly don't know um, how the Ten Commandments serve as a theological foundation for our ethics and for our understanding of justice and righteousness, right? And so when it comes to us doing justice, what we run to is we run to the Decalogue, right? And the Westminster Larger Catechism is amazing on this, with giving us that pattern of what is the commandment first, right? And then what is forbidden, and then what is required.
Right.
That's how we understand justice. What are the commandments of God? What do the commandments of God forbid? And what do the commandments of God require? That's how we get to justice. And I think what's happening is what people are doing is instead of looking at what justice is, we're getting off track. And we're getting off track because we have a wrong definition of injustice. If injustice is disparity or disparate outcomes, then justice has nothing to do with the law of God, and it has everything to do with the law of man, you see. Right. And that's why we're having these conversations where we're talking past one another, right? Because if disparities are what we're trying to fix, then you don't go to the Decalogue. If disparities are what you're trying to fix, then Ibram X. Kendi and his anti-racist amendment to the Constitution, that's the answer.
Yeah. All right. Before I let you go, give us an overview of your book.
Well, what I do is I start with that thought line, really just to kind of quickly, almost as quickly as I did here, give people an understanding of these ideas and what we're talking about. And then I have a couple of chapters about me. There's chapter 1, a Black man, chapter 2, a Black Christian. And really in that first chapter, I'm talking about where I come from.
I really enjoyed that, by the way. Your personal history was great to read.
Yeah. And I did that because there are a lot of people, I get emails from people who, because I'm, for the last 5.5 years, have been living and serving in Zambia, they assume that I hold the positions that I do because I don't understand America.
Yeah.
And so that chapter is like, okay, wait a minute. Here's who I am. I'm a boy from South Central LA, right? So here's who I am. And in a Black Christian, I talk about, my conversion and how I had to begin to think differently. I was as pro-Black as anybody you've ever known. I was a new Christian wearing T-shirts with Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X on, right? I started the Black Student Fellowship at Houston Baptist University. I was responsible for bringing a Black fraternity onto a campus where it had not been. I mean, that was me to a T. And I want people to understand that. And then I go into Seeking True Justice. That's the chapter that we talked about, the false narratives. And then I have these chapters in the middle where I talk about a new religion, a new priesthood, and a new canon, really trying to outline this movement and the fact that it is a religion, the fact that it does have a new priesthood, and the fact that it does have a new canon, and that people are talking about this canon. You've got people saying, articles about the anti-racist curriculum that white people need, right? The Bible's no longer sufficient. And then I sort of look at the damage, right? The ground is moving, the damage, the aftershock, what's going on and what's at stake. What are the things that we're seeing, the problems that we're seeing? And then I close with that whole idea of where we go from here. And then there's that last chapter where I talk about what I believe is the most powerful tool in all this, and that's the tool of forgiveness.
Yeah.
Where I tell the story of my first trip to Africa, my first trip to Zambia, and then 85-year-old African man, greets
It was a
me.
great story.
Great story. And how I had to wrestle with the fact that here I was back in Africa with, where I was sold. A lot of people think about slavery and they think about white people running into Africa, taking Black people away. And that's not what happened.
Yeah.
My fellow Africans sold my ancestors into slavery. Yeah. And I had to forgive them. And then recognize the providence of God and how he, multiple generations later, allowed me to be raised in the greatest country in the history of the world, have the best theological education anyone has ever had access to, and then come back all those years later and to be able to make a deposit in that land that my ancestors were taken from.
Amen.
And so that's kind of where I try to bring all this together at the end of the book.
It was a moving chapter. It really was. It was a great story.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking to Voddie Baucham about his important new book, very important, very timely new book, Fault Lines: The Social Justice Movement and Evangelicalism's Looming Catastrophe. It's a needed contribution to a very contemporary subject. I hope it'll become an immediate bestseller, brother. All of you out there, buy 3 copies, give 2 others to your friends, pass them around. It's a very important book for today. Voddie, thanks for your faithful work, and thanks for talking to us today.
Bless you, brother. It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Have you ever wished you could keep up with the dozens, hundreds, and maybe even thousands of Christian books you would love to read, but you know you don't have the time? Have you wondered if you will ever read through a small fraction of what you would like to read? Maybe you have wondered how anyone keeps up. If you answered yes, then Books at a Glance is for you. Books at a Glance helps you learn more in less time. How do we do that? We help you learn more in less time by summarizing the key points of a book into 7 to 10 page summaries, so that you learn chapter by chapter what the book says, but in only 7 to 10 pages. Just think of the time and frustration that will save you. Plus, if you want to get access to the content on the go, you can always listen to the audio recordings. We focus on mainly the newest and most relevant, solid Christian books, but we summarize older important books also. Books at a Glance is for book lovers who are serious about learning God's Word. When you invest just a small amount of time going through the valuable materials that we give you, you'll discover just how much you will learn in such a small amount of time. Go ahead, give it a try for free for the first 30 days. And if you're not entirely satisfied with the service, you can cancel the service and we won't charge you a dime. That is a risk-free way to expand your learning and spiritual growth exponentially. Register now at www.booksataglance.com.